Have you ever felt like you just pick up on things that other people completely miss? Well, if you feel like you've got more than the standard five senses, the words society has used to describe you over the last 100 years have been on a seriously wild ride. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating journey. We are going to trace exactly how the labels for sensitive individuals completely shifted from these highly mystical terms to modern psychological language. So are you a seer? Are you an empath? Or, just highly sensitive? I want you to really think about that for a second, because this question absolutely hits the nail on the head when it comes to the modern identity crisis so many perceptive folks face right now. Depending on who you ask, or literally what decade you're living in, your exact same traits could get you labeled in vastly different ways. To make sense of all this, we're going to break it down. We'll start with 1, the identity crisis, then move to 2, from mystics to parapsychology, 3, the rise of the empath, 4, cross-cultural perspectives, and finally 5, reclaiming what it means to be spiritually perceptive. Let's get right into it. Part 1, the identity crisis, or what we like to call the kaleidoscope of labels. A whole century of shifting terminology has created some overwhelming confusion. There's this great quote that says, "A kaleidoscope of assignation happens all around us as we try desperately to figure out what we are." And it's so true, right? When society is just constantly diagnosing you and then completely relabeling you a decade later, it leads straight to self-isolation. It's incredibly hard to build a real community when you're stuck trying to figure out if you're an indigo or just a sensitive. I mean, how are you supposed to find your people when you don't even share the same vocabulary? All right, moving to part 2, from mystics to parapsychology. Let's track this massive shift. When you lay this all out chronologically, the transition is honestly mind-blowing. In the early 1900s, this stuff was deeply mystical. You were a spiritualist medium or a seer. Fast forward to the 1950s, and suddenly there's a hard pivot to science. Now it's parapsychology and ESP. By the 1990s, the vibe shifts to New Age empaths. Then in the 2000s, it's highly sensitive persons, backed by soft neuroscience. And today, in the 2020s, the conversation is literally all about biological interoception. It's a direct, fascinating pipeline from the sacred right straight into modern biology. And what this era-by-era breakdown really shows us is a massive change in cultural attitudes. We essentially moved from an occult folk religious framework in the 1900s straight into a sterile parapsychology lab mid-century, and then ultimately landed in personality psychology and biomedicine today. The societal consensus quite literally went from sacred to highly suspect and finally to purely psychological. Let's actually pause in that mid-century era for a second, because this is when they really tried to make it formal. You've got ESP, or extrasensory perception. This became a huge umbrella term for things like telepathy and clairvoyance. During the 1950s, and even stretching into the 70s, these abilities actually had a brief, shining moment of genuine lab-style respectability. Picture this: serious academics wearing crisp white lab coats at major universities actively trying to quantify clairvoyance. They use things like Zener cards, those decks with the stars, the wavy lines, the circles, for these extensive card-guessing experiments. For a hot second, the scientific method was aggressively applied to the mystical. But, well, over time, that broader scientific consensus hardened into strict skepticism, and ESP got shoved into the pseudoscience box. Which brings us to part 3, the rise of the empath and reframing the whole experience. So that mounting skepticism forced yet another massive change. To escape the heavy stigma of being discredited as a psychic, society just kind of softened its language. We essentially traded the Victorian seance room vibe of the paranormal framework, words like medium and seer, for the modern therapy culture vocabulary. That's your psychological framework: empath, highly sensitive person, intuitive. The entire focus shifted away from the whole predicting the future thing over to profound interpersonal emotional attunement. And yeah, this framing definitely helped depathologize people, making it way more acceptable in polite society. But it also arguably watered down that deeper spiritual dimension into just, well, a personality trait. And now, by the 2020s, modern science has aggressively reclaimed the concept of a sixth sense, but absolutely not in the way you might think. Now, it refers purely to physiology. We're talking about proprioception, which is your innate sense of where your body is in space. We're talking interoception, your ability to feel internal states like your own heartbeat or digestion, even immune system monitoring. Science totally uprooted the sixth sense from ESP and just folded it entirely into the physical body. It was completely despiritualized. And that left a whole lot of perceptive individuals feeling like their full experience still just wasn't being captured. So let's zoom out a bit for part 4, cross-cultural perspectives, taking a global view. While Western language was busily shifting toward psychology and biology, it is fascinating to realize that this core human experience is completely universal. It's really just the cultural framing that changes. Over in the West, we lean heavily on terms like HSP or empath. But if you look globally, African traditions use powerful terms like sangoma or nganga. In Indian and Buddhist traditions, you're looking at the seer, the yogi, or the buddhi. Every single one of these traditions recognizes the exact same perceptive abilities. They just frame them around what their specific culture values most. And just look at the contrast in those values. It is fascinating. In the Western frame, being spiritually perceptive is seen as this highly private identity. It's an individualized personality trait, which means you need rigorous self-care, strict boundaries, and you often have to retreat from the world to cope. Contrast that with the African frame, where it is absolutely viewed as a communal responsibility. The perceptive person is recognized as a ritual specialist, an ancestral mediator. In that context, it's a sacred community vocation meant to serve others. It's not just some highly sensitive personality trait you have to go manage by yourself in isolation. Which leads us perfectly into part 5, reclaiming spiritually perceptive as a unifying modern framework. So with all of this historical and global context, where does that actually leave us today? Well, to resolve a literal century of identity crisis, there's a really powerful modern movement happening right now to unite under one rigorous, self-chosen umbrella term, spiritually perceptive. And the beauty of this term, it was coined by the community for the community. It gives people a soft landing. It provides an objective truth that shields them from the constantly shifting sands of external medical or societal labels. By having a united, grounded community, we can gently guide newly awakened folks instead of just immediately hitting them with confusing or highly stigmatized jargon like starseeds or mutants. But practically speaking, how do you talk about being spiritually perceptive in the real world without people instantly writing you off as pseudoscience? Well, there are 4 concrete, highly effective ways to handle the language. Step 1, borrow somatic language. Ground the experience by calling it high-threshold sensitivity. Step 2, retain your spiritual role language, but translate it clearly into something like energetic or emotional pattern recognition so modern ears actually get it. Step 3, use traditional words like clairvoyance strictly as a metaphor for rapid intuitive processing. And step 4, anchor your abilities in a cultural lineage. Treat your perception as a cultivated sensitivity that's fully oriented toward truth-telling and community service. There's this amazing quote from Alycedylan that wraps up this entire journey perfectly. She says, "We are on the leading edge of the evolution of humanity, and despite all we have heard and even experienced, we are not broken." I just absolutely love that. It totally underscores the vital, evolutionary role of spiritually perceptive people in our world today. Look, no matter how many times the labels change, from mystic to test subject to empath to highly sensitive person, the fundamental human capacity here is entirely real. Your perception is not a flaw, it is a profoundly beneficial part of our collective human evolution. So I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. If you could define your own sixth sense, completely outside of a century's worth of shifting external labels, what would you call it? Really think about your own unique experiences, your distinct intuitions, and how you genuinely perceive the world around you. You do not have to fit neatly into the little boxes society keeps drawing and redrawing. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer today. I truly hope this look back through history empowers you to confidently and completely unapologetically explore what you are truly capable of.